First of all, it's absolutely lovely to be here, and I thank everybody that invited me. It's nice to meet Anne. I met her via email, but it's nice to see her in person. And Brian, who is helping organize stuff. And I'll even thank Peter German. And I put him last there because he invited me just to come to a one-day workshop. And I thought, well, that's easy, like a trip to Vancouver, a one-day workshop. He didn't tell me I was actually doing the open session. That sort of dribbled out in sort of later emails. So it's lovely to be here. The sun is shining now. I asked for only one thing, and that was that they put me at the Sylvia Hotel, and they did. And I absolutely love it. It's my favorite hotel, I think, literally in the whole world. So I'm absolutely delighted. So I thank the organizers, and again, I thank everybody that allowed me to sort of be here and speak to you today. Topic, of course, is money laundering and corruption. And the title of my presentation is The Enemy is Us. And that's stolen from two people. William Chambliss, a criminologist, stole it from Pogo, the cartoonist, who said, "We have met the enemy and they is us." The idea being that we're all implicated in this thing called corruption and to some extent even organized crime. When they invited me to sort of speak, and the theme, of course, the elephant in the room, if you will, was all of the issues around sort of the housing situation, if not crisis, certainly a situation. My presentation is not specifically looking at the housing situation at all, but in thinking about what I was going to talk about today, I sort of tried to sort of look at the kinds of stuff that flows out of housing. You've got the construction, and whenever you've got construction, you very often have corruption. You've got fraudulent real estate deals in some cases. You have political expediency. You always have political expediency, no matter who's in power. You have accusations of racism, whether or not you have actual racism. I'm always more inclined to think that you have class jealousy, you have elitism, you have people with a whole lot of money and people with less. Money laundering, and it's not just money laundering, it's foreign money laundering and it's local dirty money laundering. So it's a mix of stuff. Immigration issues play a part, taxation, revenue, lost opportunities, and sort of a theme that certainly comes through the media is this idea of a middle class that's sort of losing out. All of those issues are maybe to some extent will come in and out of the discussions throughout the day. I'm really just looking at money laundering and corruption and organized crime. And now I say the bad news. You're all here. I don't know why, because no one cares about either of those things. And of course, what I'm saying is, if you sort of look at some of the mechanisms we have in place and some of the stuff that we allow or even encourage, it looks like, in fact, no one really cares. And of course, what I'm really getting at is the fact, and what everybody in the workshop will be getting at, is we need to care. We need to care more. We need to make more changes. What we're often dealing with when we're looking at money laundering, corruption, and organized crime, we're looking at crimes of the powerful. And it's very, very difficult dealing with crimes of the powerful for all kinds of reasons. Powerful in what kind of way? Financial, political, influence, all kinds of things. So what is my evidence to say that we don't care enough or we're not doing enough? I'll be looking, first of all, at the issue of corruption. I'm going to be looking at how we define certain behaviors. organized crime versus corruption, for example. I'm going to be looking at the policing of corruption cases. I'm going to be looking at investigating police corruption. I'm going to be looking at what our courts are doing, and I'm going to be sort of mentioning a couple of corruption cases in Canada. So first of all, in terms of, I'm not going in, I know that Peter and I know that Jerry after me will be going in details. But I just wanted to start off by sort of how the public, how the media, how the television tends to sort of think about organized crime. And I'm arguing that we take a far too narrow view of who we put under that umbrella. What we know about organized crime, or what we think we do, there's a process involved, it's ongoing activity, it involves some kind of structure, it has to have some kind of potential to intimidate or some kind of violence. We know that legislatively, it's in our criminal code under criminal associations legislation. It includes participating in the activity. It includes commission, it includes instructing. And yet still we think of it as being mobsters. We think of it in that kind of a way. So my question to start off with is to try to get us to sort of think about corporate and political corruption as actually part and parcel of organized crime. And to some extent, I'd like to go back to Edward Sutherland, who no one needs to care about, criminologist, 1939. The reason we care about him is that he came up with the conception of white-collar crime. What that did, I argue, is it separated organized crime into two categories. The mobsters, the Rizzutos, the Hells Angels, the stereotypical Godfather kind of person, and on the other side, the businessmen, the politicians who commit crimes. Now, if we go back to that the process that I talked about, it's hard to see a difference between those categories. And I'll sort of use for an example, and I know that in the course of the day you're going to get a lot more information on the Charbonneau corruption scandal in Quebec. But when you look at that inquiry, what do you see? You see politicians at both levels, provincial, municipal. You see bureaucrats. You see the Hells Angels. You see the union leaders. You see the Rizzuto family. You see all of the major construction companies, the so-called Fabulous 14. You see city engineers, and you see civil servants. And yet, again, you look, oh, look, there's organized crime in the middle. I would argue no. That whole package is an organized crime operation that went on for decades. Here's a not particularly brilliant, but nevertheless our attempt at sort of diagrammizing the Charbonneau inquiry. And you have everybody there. You've got your unions, you've got your construction people, you've got your government, you've got a detailed bidding process, your engineers, and yeah, of course you've got your Hells Angels, and yes, you've got your Rizzutos. But I'm arguing that this is your organized criminal conspiracy, and those people that were actively involved in it are organized criminals, and therefore should be treated and thought of in that way. Leonard Cohen, while he's still alive, we all have to quote him whenever possible. Things aren't looking too good for Leonard. Everybody knows that the dice is loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everyone knows that the fight was fixed. That's how it goes. Everybody knows. Everybody knew about Charbonneau for decades. And that's another issue. Falling out of Charbonneau, one of the conclusions was that there was a culture of impunity operating. 10 years earlier, at the Gomery Commission, that was the sponsorship scandal. The conclusion out of that was that there was a culture of entitlement that had developed. Again, this whole notion of opportunity, resources, and influence of some sort that literally runs amok. I just put this in because I kept thinking my slides were finished, and then I'd open the newspaper and there was something ludicrous looming. This was just 2 days ago, sort of a follow-up from the Gomery during the testimony of a Jacques Caraveau for fraud and forgery, whatever. It came out in the testimony that back in 1998, when Pierre Corbière pled guilty to influence peddling, he pled guilty to corruption because they offered him $40,000 to plead guilty to corruption. So, I mean, isn't there something crazy about you're charged with corruption, but in the meanwhile you're working out a corrupt $40,000 deal in order for your plea, so that the accusation of corruption would not spread throughout the political party. And that was sort of what was important about that. Who is immune to corruption? Well, during the Charbonneau inquiry, well, Revenue Canada is frantically trying to sort of trace the money, and which is difficult in corruption schemes. It transpired that some of the money was flowing into the pockets of Revenue Canada pockets. During the Gomery inquiry, well, the RCMP was building cases against people guilty of corruption in the sponsorship scandal. The Auditor General found that, in fact, the RCMP had set up their own bank account. You don't do that as a government organization. They set up their own bank account, and some of the sponsorship money was put into that. Was it criminal? Probably not. Was it dubious? Absolutely. Auditor General called it highly inappropriate, which is sort of a nice word of saying it's probably even more than highly inappropriate. A much overused cartoon, but the idea of organized crime, government, private sector, you name it. So many people are engaged in questionable conduct. Robert Blakey, who, well, you don't need to know anything about Robert Blakey, except he drafted the US Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization Statute. The only reason we care about that is that basically globally, certainly in terms of Canada, we had Robert come to Solgen and Justice in Ottawa on 3 separate occasions when Canada was developing our criminal association legislation. So Blakey was sort of important in terms of how you should look at organized crime. The RICO, in discussing RICO, basically he concluded that if officials operate like racketeers, then they are racketeers. And the idea of looking beyond the quote-unquote usual suspects. And of course we had falling out of, or in fact before Charbonneau, leading into Charbonneau, we had a case there where you've got the former mayor, you've got a city manager, you've got the director of engineering, all charged with gangsterism, basically charged with racketeering. And that was sort of using then our criminal associations legislation against people that you don't tend to categorize as organized criminals. We're going to see Iceland again, but there again, this morning I turn on the news. Turns out that a party called the Pirate Party is possibly going to win the election in Iceland. And I don't know about a party called the Pirate Party, but nevertheless, they're only here because, and we'll look at them again when I'm looking at banks, because they actually charged and put in jail 9 bankers, which is, as the thing says, by allowing bankers to be prosecuted as criminals, Iceland opted for a different strategy in the wake of the financial crisis. And again, we'll look at sort of how Canada and how most other countries, if not all other countries, have dealt with the corruption involved in the financial market. Justin Dentino and Freddie Martens, among all kinds of other people, argue that we make a distinction between businessmen, good, businessmen who just get tricked or somehow seduced into sort of committing crimes, whereas in fact, we maybe ought not to see it in that kind of way. Maybe that is a false dichotomy. If you are engaged in ongoing criminal activity or corruption or whatever, then in fact, you're no longer on the side of the angels. Policing corruption, and of course we all love this photograph, and I was going to say I apologize to the RCMP, and that's not true, because I'm not attacking the RCMP. There were probably very good reasons for them not caring about corruption when they were doing their drug investigation. They were focused on drug investigations. They wanted to get the residuos on drug trafficking. That was all to the good. But this is an this was part of their surveillance. And you've got, I mean, what's funny is why is the most senior mobster putting money, stuffing money into his socks? You'd think he'd have a man bag or you know, or something. But anyways, he's putting money in his socks. And so the commissioner said, "What did you do when you saw that?" And the RCMP corporal said, "The tape kept rolling, but we weren't listening." And that would be fine enough, but again, the commission had to fight the RCMP and actually had to go in court to actually get those wiretaps and actually get to use them in the Charbonneau inquiry. Now again, we all understand, or we can understand why the police working hard on a criminal investigation would hesitate to hand it over. But again, at least to me, it does emphasize priorities. Drug trafficking, high. At least it was at that stage, but I'll mention it's no longer high anymore. Drug trafficking, high. Corruption, not on the scale at all. Policing priority, oh, in fact, here it is right here. Now, again, not to be cynical, but he's maybe getting ready for budget time. Paulson, almost on a weekly basis, now tells us quite accurately, one imagines, that their funds are now being drifted into or snatched into or swept away by anti-terrorist activity. And they've lost resources for organized crime, financial crime, economic crime, corruption, what have you. So that's a real structural situation. And again, it speaks to priorities. Terrorism, anti-terrorism activities high, corruption not on the play at all. Corruption-related police investigation, why are there so few? Well, resource intensive, time consuming, difficult. Targets are too often too powerful to prosecute. Cases often fail. Then we wonder why they don't do more of them, for a whole lot of reasons. Again, Freddie Martens, who I had mentioned his name before, some of you may know, he was head of the Pennsylvania Organized Crime Commission, and they went after the Attorney General for fraud. They convicted him. The Attorney General went to jail, and in the process, the state annihilated the Pennsylvania Crime Commission. And as Freddie says, few events in the course of the career of law enforcement will be more lethal and career challenging than investigating political corruption. They're able to mount political opinion defenses. They're most adept at using their powers to dissuade others. These investigations are time-consuming, complex, require tenacity, skill, and political will. Commodities often in short supply in most law enforcement agencies. They're very difficult, and we should not be surprised that there are very few. And I just throw this up. I know that at least one of the speakers, and probably more, are going to acknowledge the international focus on anti-corruption. And this, again, was just in the newspaper the other day. Freddie suffered personally and career-wise, and the demise of the Pennsylvania Crime Commission. Here you have a Madonsela from South Africa who has had assassination attempts at her. She's been threatened with peril. which doesn't sound good, whatever peril is. Media campaigns have operated against her, large campaigns, all the rest of it. In response to this, she's the anti-corruption fighter in South Africa, and she's now considered to be a hero, sort of worthy of sort of Mandela. In response to the assassination attempts, she said, if it's your time to go, it's your time to go. Now that takes heroism, and that's all I have to say about that. Nigel Hodgkiss is now head of building and construction in Australia. He used to be Assistant Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police and the National Director of the Australian Crime Commission. When he went over to construction, he said that he was leaving the tranquil world of organized crime for the construction industry. You know, just as a statement of the violence, the chaos, the complexity of construction and trying to monitor and regulate in any kind of a way. He called upon the police. He said, years of police unwillingness to act on evidence and intelligence has allowed a hell of a lot of criminal activity to occur in the building industry. Investigating police corruption, corruption by police officer. I'm not going to spend very much time sort of looking at that at all, except to say that is really no different than the difficulty you run into trying to investigate corruption outside of a police department. I'm quoting here from somebody from the Metropolitan Toronto Police who was head of a homicide. Before being assigned head of internal affairs to investigate the drug unit in Toronto, the corrupt and eventually convicted drug unit in Toronto. He said, when you're in homicide, everybody loves you. The public, the chief, everybody. When you go and, oh no. You can tell that this is his slide, and this is an act of violence on his part to do this to me. When you go to look internally, then in fact nothing works. The chief turns against you, the union turns against you, your colleagues turn against you, and in many cases it is literally the end of your career. That case went on for 15 years, and as I said, there was a conviction at the end, but it went on for 15 years, and it was for conviction for something much more minor than the case that started out. Now let's look very, very quickly at the court, and I just wanted to encourage anybody that's interested to look at corruption in America by Teach Out. To some extent, you might think of it as a side issue to this, but she argues that historically, but to be a public servant initially was a moral obligation. It was an ethical calling. You didn't take anything. And she's got sort of examples where just the littlest thing, you just didn't take anything. You didn't take money, you didn't take anything. And then, of course, to have that evolve into sort of Citizens United federal election where the whole creation of the PACs have come into being. Now, Hillary, pushed on probably by Bernie, has said that she's going to reopen or try to sort of overturn that. But the idea of the role of money, and today in the television this morning, of course, we're obsessed with the fundraising dinners that the various candidates in Canada here are rushing through before the legislation sort of tightens up. There was another case, and again, I'm only mentioning it because it was the Virginia governor who was initially found guilty. But the case had to sit on this idea of quid pro quo. In order to find somebody guilty, you have to be able to relate a public service act with one particular thing that has been gained, one service or one something. That is very difficult. So the case, guilty at first, was overturned, but the judge said there's no doubt that this case is distasteful. It may be even worse than that. But the idea that the case had sort of taken too broad of a look. And again, we don't care about the United States particularly, except that when we look at our criminal code, we see this same sense of needing to sort of link a service with an act. One of the journalists out of Quebec called the Charbonneau Inquiry an expensive disappointment. The inquiry did not unveil a single case where a specific contract was obtained in exchange for a specific political contribution. I think at the end of the day, they actually succeeded in doing that. But my point here is that, in my view, that really misunderstands what corruption is all about. When we sort of look at the flow of money in Charbonneau, what you're looking at is a normalized exchange relationship. Maybe you don't always have a quid pro quo. I'll give you this, you'll do that for me. What makes it worse than quid pro quo is the fact that it's normalized exchanges that go on forever. So that's only what I'm emphasizing there. Close to home, and again, I'll sort of speed through this. There's just some that I was going to say amuse me, and they hardly amuse me. York University, my university, has received $20 million to create something called the Dali Institute for Global Health. The Panama Papers revealed, but we didn't need the Panama Papers. The United States was already concluded that Victor Philip Dali was the mystery middleman consultant who had enriched himself to the tune of something like $400 million in markups via bribes. York gave him this spring, York gave him an honorary doctorate, and he addressed the graduates, and this was even worse. He advised the graduates to appreciate the power of trust, staying true to one's values and giving back to the community. Don't you think he should be struck with lightning or some such thing? So that, do we care about corruption? Infrastructure, this is the big thing, and I know that somebody is speaking in my own notes, which of course I've long moved beyond, but in my notes I mentioned the name of the person who in the course of today is going to be looking specifically at procurement, which is such a big issue there. Canada, across Canada, this is going to be a very big year for infrastructure. Ontario, BC, every province, huge, huge amounts of money are going into infrastructure. Something I don't know anything about except what I read, the talk out of Ottawa where they're talking about an infrastructure bank, the idea being to entice international money, to partner in what's called P3s, private-public partnerships. And again, the debate is, well, who's going to decide the priorities? Is it going to be the international people with all the money that are deciding, or are we going to decide? Wherever there's doubt, it opens it up to corruption. Porter, we don't need to worry about Porter, except again, the health centers seem to be particularly vulnerable. There we have Harper, who made Porter head of Canadian Security Intelligence Service. He, in fact, received $2 million in secret commissions from SNC-Lavalin, whatever, all kinds of kickbacks. When they asked her, why would he do that? He had an incredible CV, and he had incredible contacts. And why would the CEO of Lavalin be involved? And basically, one of the conclusions they came to, no one stopped them. How do you stop somebody as powerful as Porter? How do you stop somebody as powerful as the CEO? It's a problem where you have these types of executives who are seen like half gods. It's extremely difficult to challenge them to say, hey, boss, are you doing the right thing? Giorgio is just another interesting one, and it's from a health center. He started at the St. Joseph's, moved on to York University, where he was in charge of procurement for the university. His transcripts are all on the web, where he acknowledges signing off invoices for his friends for work that wasn't done. York didn't charge him. In fact, they wrote him a fairly glowing recommendation. He moved on to St. Michael's Hospital, where he presided over a $300 million construction, and on and on and on. And the only reason for that, anybody here who has ever tried to get $10,000, an NGO who's tried to get a contract for $20,000, the number of hoops you go through, the letters of recommendation, the proposals, the this, of that. Seemingly, once you get up into the $300 million range, the due diligence drops away, and personality, contacts, influence seems to rule. Where is the accountability? Dajali didn't obviously go to jail. Porter died. That would be the only justice there. And nothing happened to Giorgio. Dorothy McBarnett, to suggest that the key is staying on the right side of the line is not what you do, but the way that you do it. Is not to simply a distinction in style, a matter of cleverness or moral choice, but to underline the significance of opportunity and resources. And that's the key behind many or most of the crimes of the powerful. Why do we care about corruption? You're going to hear a whole day of why we need to care. We care when it's linked to political expediency. We care when the media blows up an issue. Interestingly, often when you look at when we do have corruption inquiries, they're brought by the party out of power. And of course, Chambliss is the one that argues that that's an important sort of a consideration. Why do you have a Charbonneau? It's not sort of hard to untangle who was fighting for that. Why did you have a Gomery? Who was fighting for that? So there's a less than honorable explanation in some cases. The media is dominantly important, and the public is really important in terms of fighting for exposure of corruption. And of course, international pressure, and I know we were talking this morning in the introduction about Transparency International, powerful organization at putting a light on a country's activities around corruption. Who is most influenced in terms of combating corruption? I argue it's the media. I don't think it should be the media, but I argue that it often is. My neighbor is Brian Gable, and on that basis I chose to steal his cartoon here from the Globe and Mail, the Vancouver real estate market, and there you have Canada Revenue sort of relaxing in the background there. Why should we care? Again, when you're looking at organized crime, almost any and every organized crime market certainly benefits from corruption, and in many cases it requires corruption. Let's look quickly at money laundering. Why don't we care, or how don't we care, or what is the indications that we don't care about money laundering? And I know I'm always picking on lawyers, and I'll just pick on them once again. Lawyers, bankers, Revenue Canada, Financial Action Task Force, policies that enable money laundering. Again, you're going to get in detail sort of the legislation related to money laundering. But the legislation regarding money laundering is actually proceeds of crime, and it's a crime to basically do anything or everything with dirty money. I think Peter's going to be talking about that. And if you tend to sort of get money in one form, you're going to have to do something with it, unless you just put it under your pillow, which isn't a bad idea. Some of the schemes are really sophisticated. A lot of money laundering is just spent. And I was shocked at how many of my students don't know Jimmy Buffett. What has happened? What has happened with the youth? Now, this is Jimmy, not Warren. I've done a bit of smuggling. I've run my share of grass, made enough money to buy Miami, and I pissed it away just as fast. That's what often happens with dirty money, and that's fine. That goes into the economy, and depending on what Jimmy actually did with it, I suppose. We're concerned about the more sophisticated, the larger kinds of schemes. And then we've got to look at the role of professionals and the people who enable money laundering. That's your lawyers, that's your accountants, that's your bank officials. This was our chart from Stephen Snyder and I guess the original one, but also the later one. If you've got money, certainly the financial institutions, the banks are involved. This next one is a bit of a misnomer in the sense it's the insurance, but often in the RCMP cases, people just bought insurance to go with whatever it was they'd spent the money on. The big one that I'm emphasizing is the lawyers, the role of lawyers. I am not, no matter how much I emphasize lawyers, I'm not assuming that they're all corrupt. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say most are not corrupt. But some are. And even if they're not corrupt, by what I'm going to be talking about, by them being exempted from suspicious transaction reporting, to some extent it even puts them at risk, because then they've got to be making decisions regarding the money that's coming in. Whereas mandatory reporting, like the casinos, like the car dealers, like the real estate, like whoever deals with cash, these are some interesting cases. I really liked the Simon case because he was, it was a sting operation. He's negotiating with the undercover RCMP officer as to what percentage he's going to get of the dirty money as sort of commission for serving as a lawyer. They negotiate a price. Anyways, of course, he ends up being convicted because the RCMP was, of course, bringing the case. And he got a 3-year sentence. He thought that was really unfair. He appealed it, and he ended up with 5 years. Maybe it happens a lot. I wasn't familiar with cases where your appeal would actually get you more time. The Peter Shonican case I really like, because you can imagine how pleased the police were to hear this. A Toronto lawyer was caught on police wiretaps boasting there wasn't a fucking judge who would authorize a wiretap on his conversation. I'm untouchable, untouchable, untouchable by the police. That's the kind of wiretap that the police like to have. So as I mentioned, the lawyers are exempt from reporting to FINTRAC, our body in Ottawa, where you put your suspicious transactions or large-scale transactions. And that was fought by the lawyers. And somewhat cynically, I say it was fought by the lawyers, but the justice people that were fighting were also lawyers, so I'm not sure whether their heart was in it, but it did go to court, and the lawyers won because of the duty of commitment to the clients, the principle of fundamental justice, the whole confidential information, the whole privacy was more important than money laundering. And maybe that is perfectly reasonable. But again, just as an example of how we prioritize, other lawyers in all other countries or in some other countries are not exempt. So there's something very powerful about, well, we know that, about our legal lobby. And of course, we know the kind of roles that lawyers can play that facilitate money laundering. Financial Action Task Force, who just completed the peer review on Canada, pointed out, in fact, it was one of the key that they pointed out, that all high-risk areas are covered by anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism measures, except legal counsel, legal firms, and the Quebec notaries. So they noted that as an exception to the compliance of Canada in the international fight against money laundering. So I'm just questioning, too powerful to change, too difficult to charge. Bankers, don't we love bankers? Why would we ever imagine that in their heart of hearts, they actually care about money laundering. Why would they? They're in the business of money, and money is money. Now, we say, oh, they care because their reputations. Well, when we did a look at what happened to the Bank of New York with all of the Russian money, if anything, their reputation increased because all of the publicity, they were seen to be sort of doing things about it, and certainly the stocks didn't go down. There didn't really seem to be any sort of lasting result. So why would we expect that they would care? They have shareholders, they have stocks, they have to make a profit. The answer has been, when banks do fall foul of the law, the answer has been big fines, and really big fines. Who pays those big fines? Probably you and I, and the shareholders and all the rest of it. Punish them with fines has been the response. And the fines are huge. We think of banks involved in money laundering as being offshore, some pathetic little island somewhere. And yeah, that's right, there are pathetic little islands somewhere that are engaged in money laundering. But offshore is also New York, and here's the Bank of New York. The bank paid $26 million for what was called a non-prosecution fine, and paid $12 million to other people. HSBC, the caption that you can't really see says, "Can I recommend putting your money into 25 tons of Mexican cocaine?" They were paid a fine of $1.23 billion. Barclays, fairly recent, fined $109 million for trying to hide, quote, the deal of the deal of the century. All bizarre red flags. They didn't ask clients' name. They relied on public internet pages to identify who their customers were. It just goes on and on. It was just, well, it was what it was. An economist must go crazy trying to sort of sort out, what happens in terms of the swirl of money, the payment of debts, and this and that and whatever on the EU. I can't follow any of it. A more recent case, the German, and the seriousness of these financial frauds and crimes is actually the possible decline of a country. We certainly saw that in 2008. People leaping out of buildings, pension plans ruined, all the rest of it. Back to one of my first slides, when we think about what is organized crime, we should put into that formula what harm is being done. And these are the kinds of offenses that have harmed literally millions of people. So there you've got the German bank. Wells Fargo, of course, is only amusing because Stephen Colbert thinks it's also amusing. That Stump, if somebody's name is Stump, and we shouldn't make fun of somebody's name, but his name is Stump, his salary was $200 million, and as Stephen Colbert says, that's teach you that white-collar crime doesn't pay. A salary of $200 million. Of course, Elizabeth Warren went after him, and it's always fun to watch Elizabeth Warren go after anyone, calling him a gutless leader and saying, you should resign, and he finally did resign. His suggestion there was that he was encouraging all of his staff to make sure that each of the customers had at least 8 different accounts, even if they weren't aware that they had those accounts. And Elizabeth said, why 8? And he said, 8 rhymes with great. So that's Stump. And then we're back to Iceland with possibly the pirate party saying, no, we're going to put these people in jail. Canada, and again, in terms of numbers, our banks are extremely active internationally in places that you would not see business. You would see sort of holding accounts. So RBC, CIBC, Scotiabank, registered companies in the Bahamas. Is that criminal? Likely not. Is it tax evasion? Maybe not. Is it tax avoidance? Probably, definitely. but it's a mix of everything. It speaks to if you're powerful enough, if you've got enough money, you work the system. And this to me is working the system. And the Panama Papers speak sort of more about Canada. And again, sort of mentioning FinTrack, they go after and charge people who have violated the suspicious and large-scale transaction mandated legislation. They go after them. So far, they have fined one bank, and then they refused to give the name of that bank. And I looked up more. I thought, well, surely the name has come out, but I couldn't find it because, of course, immediately all of the banks said, wasn't us, it wasn't us, it wasn't us. So I'm not sure who it was. They charge casinos, credit unions, money service businesses, real estate, security dealers, blah, blah, blah. One bank that they don't name. I think that this is truly, and I guess it's true because they've got the letter. CBC did a special on it. I can't think that it's not true, but it is so outrageous. I don't know why we're not all outraged. Revenue Canada sent a letter to KPMG offering amnesty to only KPMG's high net worth clients who had money in sort of what would turn out to be a sham Island of Man account. And this letter specified that if word leaked out, then the deal would be canceled. CBC's investigative report showed middle-class people and poorer people who had also taken the advice of their financial advisors that this was a perfectly okay scheme in order to avoid taxes. They got hit with fines, back payments, interest, and in some cases criminal charges, but not the high net worth KPMG clients. Why would that be? We know why it would be. Revenue wanted access to the identity of these high net worth people, so they would then have to pay taxes, no fines, no penalties, no whatever, but they'd pay taxes on the money that they had invested into that scheme. Revenue Canada acknowledged it would not be advantageous for the tax-paying public to learn that there were different systems of accountability at work. You're right, Revenue. It would not be advantageous for the public to know that. Why would they do it? The person had to then, if they chose to, they identified themselves and they paid their taxes on the money that they put into that fund, but only these high net worth individuals. Should they, KPMG be charged? And again, I tried to sort of make sure, I think this is up to date, that I think they're still debating whether KPMG should be charged. KPMG made $100,000 per client. So we are talking about high net worth individuals, people, powerful people with a whole lot of money. They admitted that they changed their practices regarding this scam in part because charges were laid against KPMG in the United States, but as far as I understand, not in Canada. And this gag order on tax experts summoned, if they wouldn't respond, they just said the case is before the court. There's some question. When you have these amnesty programs, and not just the one involving KPMG here, in some ways you are legitimating money laundering, because once you're granted amnesty, the money comes back and it's now legalized because you've now paid taxes on it. And likely there's not then a follow-up on sort of what that money actually was, because everybody's then very pleased that the money has gone into Revenue Canada's coffers. Again, I had mentioned the Financial Action Task Force, their peer review on Canada. They do talk about the supervision of real estate being loose in Canada. They talk about the dealers in precious metals and stones being loose in Canada. They mentioned that the regulations related to politically exposed persons, those would be powerful politicians in other countries, typically, who are laundering, funneling their money, draining the money out of poor, lesser developed countries. We have programs and all the rest of it, but Financial Action Task Force argued that we needed to be stronger on that. And then, of course, just one final battering on the final one here has to do with beneficial ownership. Trying to untangle corporate ownership. And I'm hoping throughout the day I learn from maybe the law enforcement people the difficulty involved in trying to do that. And all of those weaknesses are, as I said, on top of this idea of the lawyers being exempt. Getting behind the corporate wall, the beneficial ownership is an issue that I think we all have to take very, very seriously. The World Economic Forum talked about the enablers of organized crime and money laundering, and as I have said, they identified the professionals and they identified the beneficial owners. The professionals you've already talked about, beneficial ownership, I'm hoping to hear more about throughout the day. When do we care about money laundering? We care when Canada receives international pressures regarding our failure to meet our various agreed requirements. That report by the Financial Action Task Force will be interesting in terms of what Canada does with it. It's very hard to ignore the Financial Action Task Force. In some cases, I might argue they should be ignored, but nevertheless, for this purpose, I'll say they're powerful and they can't be easily ignored. I don't think that they'll bring the lawyers into line, but nevertheless, they may well serve to force Canada to work on the other weaknesses. International corruption money that leads to sort of extradition discussions. Of course, some of those discussions have to do with Chinese corruption money. Previously, at other historic periods, it was Russian corruption money. Canada does not want to be seen to be a recipient of corruption money or capital theft from some other international country. Terrorist financing, again, whenever something, and certainly our FinTrack organization, in their glossy magazine, they talk about the number of suspicious transactions related to terrorist financing. And we all, of course, really care about terrorist financing. I would argue that turning it over and dealing with it the same as we deal with money laundering is perhaps not a very effective way to do it, but nor do I have sort of other suggestions for how to do it. So we care about money laundering when we're really talking about terrorist financing. We sort of really care about money laundering if we're talking about tax evasion. But then again, it's got to be tax evasion by you and me, and not the KPMG clients or the really big, powerful people. So I'll pause for a moment so you can let this information sink in. And I thank you very much for your attention.